Numerous reports indicate that manufacturing has emerged as the favorite target of ransomware groups and hackers. In response, a new report from Industrial Media discusses the evolution of industrial cybersecurity, its current state, and the tactics hackers are using, including phishing schemes, malware, and ransomware attacks. It also details solutions in arming manufacturers with the knowledge and resources needed to win more fights on this highly complex and ultra-competitive battlefield. Download the industrial sector's new battlefield by going to manufacturing.net/cyber. Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Supply chain management has always been a priority for the industrial sector, but over the last 3+ years, its importance has been elevated for numerous reasons. The problem, from a cybersecurity perspective, is that as soon as an operational error starts to garner more attention, it also becomes a hotter target for hackers. This bullseye on the back of supply chains is exacerbated by their very nature. Disrupting the capabilities of a manufacturer, for example, also impacts suppliers and distributors. Hitting a retailer with an attack negatively impacts production and delivery partners, placing greater stress on the victimized link in the chain to potentially comply with extortion or ransomware demands. According to a recent report from IBM, the complexity of supply chain breaches resulted in them taking 26 days longer to identify and contain than non-supply chain hacks. The same report put the average cost of a supply chain compromise at $4.46 million, or about $110,000 more than the overall average. These numbers, the potential devastation of supply chain attacks, and the ongoing threat these hacks will continue to pose are no surprise to this episode's guest. Before we talk to our guest for this episode, we're excited to announce that Security Breach is being sponsored by Rockwell Automation. For more information on their cybersecurity solutions, you can go to rockwellautomation.com. It's now my pleasure to introduce Elise Manna-Browne, Director of Advisory Services at Novacoast, a leading provider of cybersecurity intelligence and response solutions. Elise, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time. We're going to hit on a couple of topics here between cybersecurity and supply chains that the audience has been inundated with, but they continue to be so incredibly important. So supply chain in particular, during the pandemic and shortly thereafter, we were hearing so much about disruptions and struggles and challenges, and then you compound that with some of the cybersecurity concerns that can also emanate from this area. There's a lot we could talk about here. What are some of the things you're seeing, maybe just over the last 6 months, in terms of trends in supply chain and how that's impacting some of the cybersecurity initiatives that are being put in place?
Sure. I think the biggest thing that we're seeing is organizations really not considering where they sit in the larger, what I've been calling the ecosystem, where they have upstream business partners, they have downstream customers, and they're maybe considering one direction or the other, but they don't tend to look at it bidirectionally. And unfortunately in this world, especially nowadays, everything is connected. One little glitch, an issue, and compromise at one organization that may seem small in the grand picture may have large downstream effects, depending on who they're making a widget for, who's ingesting their data, who's using their software that they're creating. And I think we're getting a lot more attention to that. With remote work being a piece of that during the pandemic, I think there was some cases of lots of confusion just in cybersecurity teams during the pandemic. I think as everyone was rushing to get things like Citrix and VPN access for workers to be able to work from home, IT teams and security teams were so focused on those initiatives because they were absolutely critical to the business that some of these things, even despite we've been seeing more attacks in the cyberspace in the supply chain, I think things would have been done and tasks would have been taken on to advance us in that area and protecting those assets that haven't happened in the last 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because as you mentioned, supply chain attacks they hit so much harder because it's up and downstream as well. What are some of the big vulnerabilities that hackers are taking advantage of? In the OT world, we see about different connection points. IT, maybe it can be login issues, things like that. Is there a specific vulnerability we're seeing that's really impacting supply chain?
I would say a couple of things. One piggybacks on your question regarding what happened during the pandemic. I think a lot of attackers are abusing those same pieces of infrastructure that were deployed during that in order to perpetuate their attacks. Anything from Zoom themed phishing attacks to exploiting VPNs, compromising a person's home work laptop that they're using to log into the environment with. So you're seeing a lot of that kind of coming in from places that aren't managed by the organization. So it's very hard to mitigate that risk for sure. And there was a second piece to your question, Jeff. I apologize.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, again, we saw some things from IT from a login perspective. Are these things being replicated when it comes to some of these supply chain hacks, or are these unique tactics that are being utilized?
Gotcha. So yeah, I mean, we're going to definitely see the same typical things of coming in through phishing, coming through insecure access, like an RDP, for example, to engineers plugging in laptops on a production floor, and that laptop is compromised or has had a malicious USB plugged in. So I think it's becoming more interesting because traditionally, an air-gapped operational environment that's running all the CNC machines and such, people have said, okay, it's not connected, right? There's a network within it, but it's not connected to the internet. And we're finding more times that that's either not the case or they haven't thought of all the different ways that somebody could get into that environment despite them thinking that it's segmented off.
So when it comes to some of these supply chain specific incidents, are we looking at it being something where it's a vulnerability caused by machinery or automation? Is it more of an individual element that's being manipulated? Are you seeing any trends there in terms of where it starts or what route people are taking?
Sure. I think it's often a human mistake, and we're humans that by nature we're going to make mistakes, right? So a lot of the things that have come out from a software supply chain piece, where like a SolarWinds is always the perfect example in that area. It was kind of a simple credential compromise that led to this large scale thing that became a compromise for everybody else. It's a perfect example of something coming in and flowing downstream and causing a lot of pain. But you also see things like, humans just falling for something normal in something that's building a physical widget, like an auto part, for example, where it might have been a phishing attack. It wasn't that complicated. It didn't go into the OT environment or the ICS environment, but it was used as a foothold to disrupt operations of the company to the point that production shut down. That also has a downstream effect where the car manufacturer now has to shut down their assembly line because they don't have the part that they need to create their cars. So it comes from many different avenues. We've seen anything from, contractors that were accessing an environment that were managing one device, and the security policies of the organization weren't applied to that contractor. And those were the credentials that were used. So third-party risk is usually considered a separate thing. I lump it into the supply chain piece because those are businesses and business partners we're contracting with to do things for us, and we inherit their bad practices, unfortunately.
No, I think that's a great point. I totally agree with you. And I'm wondering, have you had any experience with the pressures that the individual or the company being attacked feels then from some of its partners in the supply chain, and how they respond or react to that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So it becomes a big difference. You have a couple different decision-making points that I think a lot of those breaches occur at. The biggest one is, do we keep production going? So if an organization is able to go to offline production, just like a healthcare organization might have to go to paper charts, for example, you have to have those processes ahead of time. Your engineers, your staff, your operators still need to be able to operate their machinery in manual mode, even if they haven't had to do it in a while, or they don't have all the monitoring. And sometimes they can't necessarily shut certain things down, even knowing there's a compromise in the environment, just because they need to keep operations. They might not have the money to be able to do that upgrade or replace a device. So they do get the pressure, but they don't have the resources in more cases, more often than not, to be able to fix those things, or the fixes aren't even tolerable. An organization that might have to work in milliseconds can only have a certain level of network inspection, for example. It's just gonna have too much latency for their production.
So one of the things I wanted to circle back to is you talked a little bit about the human element, and I think that's becoming a bigger part of the conversation. It seems like we kind of walk this line in cybersecurity where we want employees to be diligent. We want them to be aware of what's going on. In the process, we sort of scare them a lot because of all of the attackers that are out there and all the different strategies that they need to be aware of. But we also want them to give us a heads up if they see something that looks bad. So how do we balance all this in terms of helping employees be part of the solution, but sort of not criminalize them when they do potentially make a mistake so that we can get after it right away?
So I agree. I mean, I think too much education can be bad. I use my grandma in examples like this. Is that she watches a lot of news and she hears about Kia cars getting broken into and stolen and all these kinds of things, and she thinks Kia is like a big evil company or they haven't done anything right or whatever. And trying to explain, these things happen, and yes, they happen every day in all sorts of industries constantly. We don't see most of the breaches that actually occur. Think about the number of ones we see in the news and the thousands behind the scenes that aren't being reported on. So I think that I like the kind of methodology of see something, say something and I think this really comes into, especially in the industrial sector, we've had multiple public cases where an operator that maybe isn't technological from an IT standpoint just notices something weird. I think at the minimum, or employees that even if they're not regularly working on a laptop. So not all just the accounting employees and finance, whatever, sales, but your operators on the floor as well. If you're a production company, manufacturer, whatever that might be, running an industrial facility, utility, in those cases, those operators still need to know that something might be weird. So things like a USB drive, not just plugging it in, no matter where they get it from, there should be a process to handle that. We teach people to hover over links in emails. It's actually almost entirely email focused. Some security trainings might be, making sure somebody doesn't follow you behind when you walk in a door, or having clean desk policies. Those are still important things. But at least if you can't educate your users on every single threat out there, which I think is impossible, to teach them to look for weird, and give them a really easy way to report the weirdness to somebody who can investigate it and decide if it's a threat. And that has to be a friendly interaction or the whole system breaks down.
No, I agree. I think those are some great points. I think one of the issues we run into in the industrial sector too is supply chain isn't necessarily part of the cybersecurity plan. And we talk about that a lot on Security Breach. Maybe you can talk about a little bit, how do we work to get that included into that plan and dealing with some of these supply chain specific breaches? And shouldn't it be a bigger part of the response in terms of reaching out to our partners and letting them know what's going on, or at least having a strategy in place to do so?
Sure. I think the first step is really baselining the risk of the environment, whether you have a dedicated risk officer or it's a CISO or just somebody that happens to be good at it, evaluating where all those different touch points with other companies. I think that's the first thing to kind of get that lay of the land. And it might be that you have thousands of business partners. That's very feasible in large scale enterprise. So at least having a list of kind of what those things are. And then also thinking about where you sit in that chain, right? That upstream versus downstream. So for an organization that might make software, you have to make sure that your dev environment's clean, your staging environment's clean, production, there needs to be source code reviews, it has to be reviewed at build process, et cetera. That's a lot of steps. And that's a lot of work right out of the gate, right? Then you start adding things like dependencies. I think that's a massive issue, because not only would you have somebody that might be making a robot, for example, or a software platform, they might be using code libraries from outside the organization. And that's where you get that conversation around SBOMs, right? The bill of materials for software. Yeah. But those dependencies often have dependencies, et cetera, et cetera. And if you detonate out those and you start looking at some of those libraries, there's a lot of open source, there's unmaintained open source. There's now attackers that are going after that code, knowing you're importing it into your environment. And most teams aren't resourced or don't have the skill sets to evaluate every little tiny piece of code, every library, every piece of script, it's too much code to look for an average team, right? Yeah. So I think in this case, I wish vendors would be a little bit more on top of it as far as how they handle the dependencies for their own applications and products, whether that's the company that's making it or somebody that's partnering with them. Things like that we hear very commonly is, I can't update this app or this system or that version of Java because the vendor's application won't work with it. So we have to keep using this outdated dependency, this outdated operating system, outdated hardware to support something. And there's really not a good ongoing model for that maintenance. And so what happens is things don't get patched and they sit there and they wait for somebody to compromise it.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that's usually what stimulates something being done, is after the fact. Are there any particular types of attacks or attack groups out there that are sort of on your radar right now that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I would say the one that I found there's kind of two out there that are pretty interesting to me, without talking about ransomware ad nauseum, because I think that's been pretty well covered in our industry. Yeah. One's Industrial Spy and one's RansomHouse. And although there's some differentiators in the way that they've operated, RansomHouse is grabbing data, but then they're trying to extort it without running ransomware, at least at this current stage. Industrial Spy was doing what they call the double extortion ransomware, where they're collecting data, they're grabbing it out, and then they were encrypting the environment. They were double extorting. One, to decrypt the environment, and two, to not sell the data. In Industrial Spy's case, what they do, or at least last time I saw their stuff, they've moved their marketplace more recently, was they were taking this data, saying, this is what we have, we're going to sell it to your competitors. They were actually using that data theft not to monetize it on the dark web, but to facilitate corporate espionage. That's not something that, at least in my career, that I've really seen be the motive of these groups. They're actually taking that data, they're trying to sell it to a competitor of the victim. And if they can't do that, they're just dropping it for free. And they'll use any tactics from email threats to phone threats with a voice distorter, all sorts of things to really bully the victim organization even more into paying a ransom, because they might lose a competitive advantage. If you lose critical R&D or intellectual property in a breach like that, and that gets in the hands of a competitor or it's leaked online, you've lost your competitive advantage as a business. That can put people out of business. Yeah. So I think that's where I think we're going to see more of that in taking advantage of it and versus monetizing it on the traditional criminal markets and just grabbing a bunch of credentials and selling that access or whatever that might be, to the actual monetization of the transfer of that data, putting it into hands that somebody might actually be able to use that contract, that IP on, whether it's a nation state actor or somebody else.
Well, it's interesting. Whenever we talk about some of these organizations that really try to take this to the next level, RansomHouse, I think, is known for kind of trying to humiliate the people they hack a little bit and exposing information if they don't pay the ransom. And in this instance, when you talk about Industrial Spy too, I always get frustrated because I think our industry, if they could just be more transparent about a lot of these hacks and about what happened, how these folks got in, and share that a little bit more, we could come up with better solutions. The battlefield's always evolving and always changing, but if we don't share more information, we're never going to get there anywhere near as close as the hackers. They're already ahead of us, but we could do things to try to at least keep pace with them. In your experience, what are some of the biggest blockades, I guess, we have to companies' willingness to share some of this information and put it out there? And how do we get there? How do we get to be more transparent as an industry in hoping to fight against some of these cyber attackers?
Sure. I would say, honestly, it's in-house attorneys that are probably the largest obstacle to that. We need them. They're critical pieces of any business. I'm not bashing in-house counsel by any measure. But I think that there needs to be a little bit of an education of the value of that information sharing, and an agreement between security practitioners and their legal teams on how do we disseminate this? Who can we disseminate it to? Whether that's they anonymize it to a certain degree, they can pass it through a third party in some cases. So there's a lot of these, information sharing and analysis centers out there. Most industries have them. There's an education one, there's a finance one, there's a health one. They all provide mechanisms to say, I saw this thing. You can't attribute it to me, but everyone else should know I saw this thing and what I saw. And I think facilitating that, sometimes legal teams won't even agree to that. They just want to keep everything in-house. I think there's a little bit of a reputational issue. The downside I don't think they recognize is that information is going to get shared anyway.
Yeah.
Even if legal says no, we're all hackers. I know how to share information without anybody seeing it, right? Not that I'm advertising that I'm passing stuff around, but ultimately, if that information needs to be shared between me and somebody that does a similar work at a similar company, or I know that it's impacting one healthcare client of mine and it's likely to impact another healthcare client of mine, maybe I know that even share facilities or something to that effect. I need to be able to share that or at least facilitate that conversation, even when they're different, separate legal entities from each other. I think that's the biggest hindrance really in our field, from just that organization to organization standpoint, because as practitioner to practitioner, we're still doing it. It's done anyway, whether it's published or not.
Yeah. So can industry handle this type of issue, or do we need regulatory action? I mean, there's already things out there where a lot of infrastructure-based entities have to share these attacks. They have to let law enforcement know. They have to report things like ransomware attacks. Do we need that throughout the industrial sector, or can we sort of police ourselves and share more of this information?
I don't know that the industrial sector is going to have a choice, to be frank. I think the big piece of that, and I'm going to be oversimplifying here because I haven't read all the levels of CMMC, but if you're familiar with that, that's really guiding not just defense contractors, but those that are suppliers or contractors for defense contractors, right? If you broaden that out, which is the way regulations tend to go, right? They just start trying to scoop in entities as part of this. I think large pieces of the United States industrial sector are going to be swept up in that because of that widget issue. They're making a widget that's ingested by somebody else, that's making another, and value add, and going through the supply chain. And I think that, unfortunately, I would love to have self-policing. Nobody really wants to work with a bunch of regulations. We're all working in too many attack frameworks and things like that now, especially if you operate across multiple countries. It becomes infinitely more complicated. The United States, I think I would like to see, hopefully, if those regulations come down, that it standardizes a little bit more what you see from a state to state level. I think some organizations and even attorney groups, and definitely myself as an incident responder, it's hard to know what the rules are in Michigan versus Wisconsin versus California when you're not dealing with the law. You're not an attorney yourself. You can have a general idea, but those aren't standardized right now. I think that's something I would like to see. Unfortunately, from a self-policing standpoint, I think it's hard to get the business buy-in in the industrial sector for C-level and the business people and board of directors and all those to understand why those things, the certain controls are being requested, that software is being requested, or whatever that is. And I think that's an ongoing issue. CISOs sometimes have a problem breaching that communication gap to get things done themselves. But a board's going to listen if the government's telling them to do it. Yeah. So I would love if we could self-police. Yeah, but I don't know that that's the way it's going to go.
Well, at least it's a conversation we're having, which is more than it was maybe 18 months or 2 years ago. So we'll see where it pans out. So we've talked about the bad guys here, Elise. Let's talk about the good guys a little bit. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about Novacoast and some of the things that you guys do.
Sure. Yeah. So Novacoast, we're a professional services organization at its core. We just do nothing but cybersecurity. That might be an engineer doing it, a dev doing it, services we provide. And then we also offer things like pen testing and incident response forensics, which is where I would say we're abutting this kind of conversation the most, either from oh my goodness, we got ransomware and we just shut down production on our manufacturing floor, to, we saw the weird thing, and if we go down right around Christmas, our peak season, and it's a retail company, all those kinds of things. So we kind of blend all that together. We try to create a holistic approach to providing that security guidance to our customers. And where I think we all enjoy as employees is, Novacoast fits in a really unique bubble that we like to solve the toughest challenges in cybersecurity. Anyone can spin up a SIM or, an endpoint, deploy an endpoint agent or whatever that is. That, there's plenty of people out there that can do that. We like the really tough to solve problems. And that's, I think, where we enjoy our work the most. And I think that's where we provide the most value to our customers, just those complex environments, which totally speaks, I think, to the supply chain issue, because you're not just dealing with your own initiatives. You also have to anticipate what everyone else is doing that you do business with.
Yeah, I've tried to advocate a lot more penetration testing throughout the operational technology, the OT environment for manufacturers. I think that could help them get better visibility and understand a lot of things that are going on and where they're most vulnerable. Is there some things you could maybe share with our audience in talking about penetration testing to sort of set their minds at ease a little bit, or help them understand, yes, that it's not an easy process, but it's extremely beneficial? I think there's a lot of concerns about shutting down or slowing down production in performing these tests. What's your takeaway from performing them and answering some of those concerns?
Sure, that's a great question. So there's a lot of different ways you can attack this issue. One is if you don't have a 24/7 production facility, even if other ones are, but all the systems are the same, run the test on the non 24/7 facility. You can do it after hours. You're not going to impact the gross pieces of it, or just test one site. Again, if the equipment and the operating systems and everything's pretty consistent, you can get away with maybe that non-critical site and testing it, at least to start getting that idea and that conversation going about what risk is in there. I think what's important for organizations when you're interviewing somebody that's going to do a vulnerability assessment, a scan, a penetration test, is make sure that they're clear on anything that is an exclusion. Make sure that you're setting that expectation. Discuss plans of, well, if we can't evaluate it, what do we do to protect it? And I think that's where that communication breaks down is, oh, we can't scan it. And then nobody looks at it again. So finding ways to mitigate any potential risk to it, even if you don't know exactly what risks might hit it. And I think there too, it's a matter of people get worried about scanners and stuff going into the environment, making sure that those aren't being done loud. Working with organizations that have run pen tests in OT environments, I think is really important. We're talking a lot about manufacturing and industrial, of course. Anything I'm saying here, I think also applies to healthcare. You still have a risk to human safety, right? Yeah. So you have to make sure you're protecting anything that could potentially touch a human, whether it's a piece of equipment moving by itself from remote control from an attacker, or cutting off a heart rate monitor or something, life support system, God forbid, or whatever that might be in healthcare. That's what's, I think, really unique in these conversations is most cyber professionals don't have to worry about the risk to human life. Yeah. It's a data protection, right? So I think that that's a piece that everyone can understand. When you kind of speak to it in those circumstances, it definitely helps kind of ease people and be like, okay, might be tough. It might take us a while to figure out how to do it right, but the cost of not doing it is not acceptable. Yeah. So the work still needs to be done. One thing that we've found, and that I kind of like is tabletop exercises. Honestly, I joke and I call it fantasy pen testing, because it allows you to kind of walk through the theory of how would I attack you and wreck everything, but I don't have to touch a system, right? So we've done quite a few of those with oil and gas companies, manufacturing and retail, where we talk through down to, okay, which ICS systems are you running? Which version of Windows are your SCADA systems running? Anything in the network that's in there, all those kinds of pieces. How is IT and OT separated? And then we walk through an exercise of how would we theoretically hack this now that we've identified these gaps, and that's done all conversation based. It's also a really good way to get a buy-in from the IT team or the executive team, the board, because you're talking in a different language. It's not just screenshots of command line and terminals and scan reports that a pen test report is going to come back on. It's going to be like, these are the gaps, you're missing procedures here, policies here, et cetera.
Yeah, interesting. I think you brought up a great point there in terms of even if you don't completely understand everything that's coming back, you're going to see what you need to protect better and help mitigate a lot of those vulnerabilities. So I think there is a definite concern about in-house expertise on OT technologies, which is understandable. Nobody's there yet, or at least not across the board. It's still a concern that needs to be addressed, but at least you're doing something to get a little bit better understanding of what's going on in your neighborhood. So, Elise, looking forward, maybe over the next 12 to 18 months, any big trends that you're seeing that we should be aware of on the cybersecurity side?
the supply chain conversation's totally going to expand, or we wouldn't be talking for sure. But I do expect the methodologies used there to continue. I think that's something we also see in fraud, where we can't even sometimes imagine all the different ways that somebody might weaponize a piece of data. That happens now, but a lot of what we see traditionally as practitioners is something that's cybercrime, organized crime. It's financially motivated, right? I do expect, especially considering geopolitical landscape, that unfortunately, I don't want to be a fear monger here, but that we will see more of these conversations where certain types of data, schematic, something that provides that competitive advantage is being stolen and either handed off to more nefarious cases. Not that I'm trying to give attackers ideas either, but I expect that. I think other pieces we're going to see is more leveraging attacks against business partners to get to a certain organization.
Yeah.
So we've seen that with, for example, like Chinese affiliated groups. They go after MSSPs because if you can get onto the SOC analyst, even if it's outsourced, SOC analyst machine while they're logging into the person you're really trying to attack, that can be a vector that goes in, and you're going to already be in the environment by the time anyone has any idea something happened.
Yeah.
So I do kind of expect that those things, like if you steal a contract from one place, okay, now you know that they do $20 million of business with so-and-so. All right, we're going to go spoof so-and-so and kind of try to get back in, or, those kinds of things where it's just cross-pollinating from breach to breach to breach. And I think, unfortunately, like the software dependency problem, that kind of balloons out, right? So yeah. I think getting ahead of it now is really what organizations need to be focused on, honestly.
No, I agree. And you're not fear-mongering. I think the more we talk about these issues and these problems and potential avenues of attack and some of the different organizations that are out there that are so much more organized, so much more complex, the better solutions we can come up with. And a lot of that fear now just becomes more of a checklist of things that we need to do to be prepare and continue to operate safely or as securely as we possibly can. So I think the conversation's good.
No, I think you touched on an interesting point. There should be a cybersecurity person involved in that procurement process. It's not something we've traditionally had to do, unfortunately, but I think going through those and having a checklist or questionnaire, what kind of access are you going to have? What kinds of software updates are we going to have, or at least until when will we have them? Knowing that stuff in advance is so important because you're going to be locked into that piece of equipment for 5 to 20 years, depending on what the equipment is. So you want to make sure at that procurement phase, and then also making those things enforceable. So that's where the attorneys become our friends again, is, okay, vendor, you said that you're going to update Java and Apache and whatever it is on this appliance that we're relying on you for, this big thing we bought. And if you don't, we're taking you to court. And unfortunately, that's a little punitive, but I think that if it's kind of that self-policing problem, if vendors aren't going to commit to helping their clients stay secure because they're just doing a one and done sale of a piece of equipment and they're on to the next place, I think that it's making the problem worse. More and more of these pieces of IoT and OT are out there with just crap code on them, or that haven't been patched in a decade, and they're still not getting patched. We still come across Windows XP in 2003 regularly in the manufacturing and oil spaces. So that makes it really difficult.
Well, I think what we're seeing too is when you talk to a lot of component manufacturers is that security by design element is a competitive advantage. And the fact that they can also show their customers, hey, it's great. You want to turn this off just for integration purposes or to get up and running more quickly. You can't do that anymore. You need to keep this going. It's designed this way for a reason. And if the legacy stuff that you're plugging it into doesn't have these same protocols, there's another opportunity as well. So it's just a great conversation to continue having. And I agree. I think there is a responsibility for suppliers to, at a minimum, have the offering and try to educate their customers. You can't lead every horse to water, but you can at least provide it for them. So,
right. Yeah, even if it ends up being, maybe we end up seeing something like support subscription models Everything seems to in our field has moved to some sort of subscription model, where it's like, okay, well, you pay for support for the next 10 years, and that's the commitment to upgrade it. But at the end of that 10 years, maybe that's when now I have to buy the new version of that equipment. It at least allows the organization to figure out the operating and capital expenditures required and budget for that large expenditure for the new piece of equipment 10 years down the line.
Thanks, Elise. And for more information on the work Elise and her colleagues are doing, you can get more information at Novacoast.com. Thanks for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IN.com, or MBTmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Elise Manna-Browne, I'm Jeff Reinke, and this is Security Breach.